Hello everybody, my name is Stuart Hamilton and I'm the Head of Libraries Development at the Local Government Management Agency in Ireland. This is the part of government that looks after the local authorities and the country's public library sector. I'm really excited to be here today presenting to you at the virtual International Library event in connection with the Sharjah Book Fair. And I am very grateful to the organisers for having asked me to come along and present. So what I'm going to do for you today is talk a little bit about the National Public Library strategy that we have here in Ireland, and then go on to talk about how that strategy has survived collision with the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects that's been felt on the country's library system since we closed the doors of our library at the beginning of March. I've got a slide deck and I'm going to work through that slide deck. I'm going to show you a little bit about what the country's libraries are up to. And I'm going to conclude by perhaps a little off the cuff thinking about what it is that we've learned and what happens when a strategy meets a crisis. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into this now. Let's have a quick look here. Yeah, this is where we are. What happens when a strategy meets a crisis? Well, I'm sure many of us have been working through this over the recent months, but here in Ireland, we've done things our own way with many commonalities with our European and international colleagues, and I'm going to talk to you about that. First of all, as I said, the national strategy, I'm going to go through that. It's important for context, and that gives you an idea of how our libraries function regardless of the current climate for COVID-19. Then I'm going to talk about the effects though, and I think if you've been following this, you'll see some similarities, you'll see some differences about how we've reacted. And then I'm going to talk at the end, as I say, about what I think we've learned and what's the impact on our strategy. The strategy is called Our Public Libraries 2022, Inspiring, Connecting and Empowering Communities. And you can see the URL at the bottom of the screen there if you want to get hold of the strategy yourself. At the start of the strategy, which sort of runs from 2018 to 2022, and it comes on the back of two previous strategies for the library sector, this was the current state of the public libraries in Ireland. We have about 330 branches across the country, and we also have mobile libraries in some of the 31 authorities that manage the libraries. And, you know, we have a significant amount of supporters of the public library system. We had around about 750,000 active library members in 2016, just before the strategy started. And you can see there some of the other figures which are important for understanding what's been going on in Ireland. Now, Ireland is a country with a population of nearly 5 million all told. And, you know, we have 17 million visits per year back at the start of the strategy to our services, and we're lending out nearly 18 million items. Fortunately, following many years of austerity, we were seeing positive investments into the library sector in the run-up to the last strategy that resulted in, you know, increased spends on books and online resources, the expansion of some of our capital projects and library buildings, and just generally a positive environment for the library sector. Now, we actually have 30 local authorities. I said 31 there, but one of our authorities combines both a city and a county. And they're overseen by the city and county librarians, who are actually my key stakeholders in my job. Local Government Management Agency, or the LGMA, the organisation that I work for as part of the library's development team, which I head up, basically works with the city and county librarians to implement the strategy that I'm about to talk to you about. It's free to use the libraries in Ireland, the public library sector. The public libraries are completely free. And we have a fantastic joined up service though. So it's a local service, we say, with a nationwide reach. You can use your local library. You can go and pick up a book there, or you can drop off a book there, but you can also borrow a book from a library anywhere else in the country and have it delivered. And when you're finished with that, you can go on holiday to another part of the country and you can drop it off at the local library there. And the national delivery service that we have will ensure that that item is returned back to its original branch. We offer a large collection of free online resources, and I'm going to talk about those in the COVID context later, because that's been an extremely important weapon for us. And there I'm talking about ebooks and e-audio books, all free of charge, and you can join up to our service with a library card. We have a national literacy and reading program called Right to Read, which is very, very important. We also have a national program around business and employment called Work Matters. And we also have something called the Healthy Island at Your Library Initiative, another national program, which looks at healthy living and uses the library resources to deliver that. Those three programs I'm going to talk a little bit more about further down in my presentation. But the entire sector and the programs that we run operate under a set of National Public Library standards and benchmarks which guide the development of the service. The strategy was developed in a very consultative way. This is something which I'm a big fan of. It wasn't developed in a back room with people just sort of deciding what it is they wanted. We asked the public library users what needed to go into the strategy. We received more than 200 responses which guided our thinking. We held focus groups with members of the public, workshops with the staff, also an incredibly important part of the process. And then we also brought in elected members, the people that we really need in the country's elected institutions to back the library sector and to support us when we need help at that governmental level. So 3 regional workshops were held with councillors and members of the Dáil, which is the parliament here in Ireland. And then again, we had further workshops with the sort of senior managers, the decision makers in the public and local authority sector, because of course libraries don't exist in a vacuum. They work alongside all of the other types of public institution that you'll find in the local authorities in Ireland, whether it's people that work with the roads, health and sanitation, the schools obviously are a very important part of the hospitals, and so on and so forth. And the strategy identified the following sort of key values and principles that really the respondents associated with the library service. Now, these words, these phrases, these values are very familiar to those of you, I'm sure, who've been looking at the library environment over the last decade or so. They're the sorts of values that we feel really represent the library sector. Anything from creativity, trust and integrity of staff, quality and excellence of service, a reputation for innovation and flexibility, and the ability to be very inclusive is something which really came out in all of our discussions and consultations, and was certainly something that we really wanted to see in the strategy as a result. So the overall vision for the programme was that the strategy, our Public Libraries 2022, would make public libraries attractive and welcoming spaces where all members of the community can access knowledge, ideas and information, and where people can reflect, connect and learn. And for me, at least, as somebody who was coming to this job, having worked internationally for many years, I used to work for IFLA, I worked at Qatar National Library prior to this job. This was a vision I could certainly get behind, because to me, it placed the Irish public libraries very much in the centre of what was happening globally for public libraries, and was a very attractive vision to help support. The ambition of the strategy was to firmly establish the library as the trusted go-to place in the community for guidance and support. And there we have those programs that I mentioned earlier on, including reading and literacy, very fundamental library activity, lifelong learning, obviously connected with that, business and employment, healthy living and well-being, these big programs which we're working with nationally and the libraries are supporting. We wanted to basically make joining the library as easy as possible, removing any barriers to joining, streamlining the processes around joining and improving people's access to the services and buildings. And once people got there, we wanted to ensure that their experience was improved from what it was before, adding new technologies, the sorts of services you'd expect to see in public libraries, extending opening hours where we can, and making the environment attractive for people to come and engage with. And we wanted to, over the course of the strategy, we still do want to, because we haven't finished yet, increase the use of our libraries and grow membership to 30% of the population. That's active members. Here you can see a top-level summary of the aims of the strategy, some of which I've already mentioned here, but there's also some more specific things mentioned. The extensioning of opening hours against a time frame there, removing fines, which I think we may be one of the only countries in the world where it's been removed entirely. Obviously, lots of local library services around the world have removed fines, but the entire sector has removed fines here in Ireland. Again, trying to reach 30% of the population through membership, and really just trying to make the library a much more visible place in people's lives that was attractive to visit and had all of the services and resources that you need for creativity, for culture, for working, for engaging with public sector services. So to do this, we needed to invest in the library infrastructure and develop new funding programs. Partnerships, absolutely crucial to the success of the strategy. Investment in the promotion of the service. Really, it's absolutely crucial that the libraries have visibility these days with so many things competing for people's attention. Promotion is absolutely crucial. We needed to upskill staff, developing staff skills to enhance the experience of the user. So staff needed to be able to use all of the new technology we were putting in. And because we were developing libraries as digital learning centres and digital enablers, we needed to make sure that our staff were up to speed on all of the technologies we were using. I mentioned the fines and the lending charges removed, gone, extremely popular, something that happened very much at the outset of the strategy, and something which has really brought people back into the buildings. Trying to reach across all age groups. There's no way we're going to get to that membership target of 30% of the population unless we can reach everybody. And then something which I'm going to come back to right at the end, connected to the investment and the funding streams piece that I just mentioned, but actually increasing the amount of resourcing available in each local authority for the purchasing of book stock, going up to €4 per head of population, where at the moment, across all of the authorities, in terms of average, we may not be close to 2. So a very, very ambitious and very concrete target, which I think was very brave and ambitious to include in the strategy. Now, I mentioned the strategic programs that we have. They're in 3 sorts of areas. We have reading and literacy. Our Right to Read literacy initiative has really exciting things across the year in terms of children's reading, and we're also working on adult literacy as well. Our learning and information contains programs on lifelong learning for everyone who wants to continue learning throughout their life. We have the business and support program, Work Matters, which was very, very important after the sort of financial crash of 2008. And as I'll go on to talk about, increasingly important now as we try to deal with COVID. And then the Healthy Ireland at the Library program, which focuses on those elements of healthy living, which we can do in association with the Department of Health. The third one is around community and culture, basically looking to establish libraries as central community, civic and cultural spaces. And here we pull in the expertise of our local studies libraries and our local studies experts, and where we can connect them with the digital sphere. So the strategic programs do cover reading and literacy, learning, information, and community and culture. If you're a library user, you're going to see against those Right to Read, Work Matters, and Healthy Island at the library as the big flagship programs. But you can see that we're trying to cover those three big areas there. Now, underpinning all of this in the strategy are what we call our enablers. We want to develop the library team, so that's all of the staff. We have about 1,600 staff in the country. So we want to try to develop a comprehensive program for library team leadership and workforce development. We have a promotion and marketing aspect. You'll recall that I just mentioned just how important it is to be visible in terms of local and national promotion areas. We developed a national communications campaign called Take a Closer Look, which was rolled out at the beginning of 2020 to draw people's attention to engaging with the library sphere. It was a highly successful activity, and year on year we managed to see a 17% increase in people joining the library during February 2020 as a result of our national campaign. Then another enabler is the R&D, the research and development that goes into the service, because obviously we always need to keep learning. We need to have the most current, most up-to-date standards and benchmarks for the service, and we need to basically develop good practice across the service elements. So research and development we see as a key enabler to the service delivery across the country. But it doesn't stop there. We also have enablers that relate to library infrastructure. The buildings, absolutely crucial. As I mentioned, we have about 330 when they're all fully open at any one time. We have a number of branches that are undergoing redesigns, or in some cases, when we're lucky, we're building new libraries altogether, and that's been going very well during the strategy. The capital building programme is worked on with the Department of Rural and Community Development, which is our parent government department, and guided by our public library standards and benchmarks. We've tried, as I mentioned, as an ambition of the strategy, to increase the availability of the service, and this means that we've extended opening hours wherever we can, ensuring that our buildings are staffed. And then in a number of locations around the country, which we've been trying to increase over the first few years of the strategy and are on track to increase on the remaining part of the strategy, our open library program, which is called My Open Library, basically outfits our branches so that they can be open without staff for a couple of hours before staff arrive in the morning and a couple of hours in the evening after staff have gone home. So we're actually able to make the library premises available to people who may be working and need to come later in the evening, or who might be able to go to the building early in the morning before they go to work. This has been very, very successful. We presently have 15 open libraries, and we're on track to get to around about 45 next year. We set an ambitious target for the strategy of 100 by the end of the strategy. I'm going to talk about whether we're going to meet that or not later on. And I mentioned again the removal of fines and charges as an important infrastructure enabler. We have installed a large amount of technology in the libraries now. Our digital learning centres have been the sort of flagship elements of that, and that's where you're able to access things such as 3D printers, Raspberry Pi. We run coder dojos, lots and lots of activities around digital equipment and digital skills for people of all ages. And then our library management system is shared by all of our authorities. So again, this is different from some countries where different authorities may use different LMSs. We have just one system which enables all of the collections across all of the authorities to be available, as I mentioned, wherever you are in the country, and supported by a national delivery service to move books, DVDs, materials all around the country in response to user demands. And then the other enabler there is our collections, which obviously is very closely connected to the LMS. And here is where the book fund target I mentioned earlier on is found. But also the collections obviously go beyond print these days, so it's digital resources as well. So these are our ebook and e-audio book collections and our e-newspapers and e-magazines, tens of thousands of titles which are available to your device wherever you are. We receive funding for the public library services at local authority level. And there we also have a small budget within the team that I have to support some of the strategy implementation, such as some of the research pieces and the communications campaign. But things like the book stock and the staffing are funded at local authority level. Now, my team, Libraries Development, does manage tenders at a national level for the entire sector. So we work with the local authorities, with the librarians at that level on the development of the tenders, but we do manage the contracts once we have them. So the sorts of things we're talking about there would be the LMS, the online resources and the book stock. And then the funding required for those things come from the local authorities in relation to the amount of population that they have in each authority. And then we can also go to the government for various sort of sector-related funding. A good example of this would be the Department of Health that we work with for the Healthy Ireland programme. We're also able to work with the Department of Rural and Community Development, as I mentioned, who fund the capital projects and the Open Library programme. There are bigger projects out there for rural redevelopment and urban redevelopment. We're able to access European funding, and then there's all sorts of different other pieces which come through Department of Rural and Community Development, including the dormant accounts funds which are available every year. I've also given a couple of examples there in that slide about other government departments. I mentioned the Department of Health, but there's also the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and the Department of Culture, who help us on a number of creative areas. Now, to get all of this done, we've got a governance structure which is set up, which in my opinion is very good and enables all of the major players who are interested in library development to be involved. As I mentioned, our parent department is DRCD. We have the local authorities and we have LGMA represented. And this all comes together in the top level of our governance, which is the Libraries Development Committee, which features senior representatives from the LGMA, chief executives from the local authorities, and then senior representatives from the Department of Rural and Community Development. So that's our top level steering group. But the work itself is really moved forward by our strategy committees. And we have three of these, strategic programs, infrastructure and service delivery. And they are made up of the county librarians. So I mentioned way back at the start of the presentation that these guys are the key stakeholders in the strategy. And my team, Libraries Development, works with the county librarians on those three committees to move the different projects forward to get the strategy complete. So an example of this might be the Service Delivery Committee has responsibility for developing the workforce training programme. So a small working group is formed of a number of county librarians and senior library staff, and then that activity is worked on with my team to bring it to fruition. And then 3 times a year, all of the county librarians come together in something called the City and County Librarians Forum, where the progress of the strategy is reported and course corrected and adjusted as needs be. We have a big emphasis on communication. My team are always trying to make sure that any developments are communicated out to the county librarians, but also trying to make sure that anything they need to share is also brought into us and then amplified out wherever it needs to go. And that regular reporting process does enable us all to keep tabs quite nicely on the progress of the strategy. All right, deep breath. So let's just have a quick sort of recap there. That strategy that I've just discussed basically ran into COVID very hard at the beginning of March. Until that time, we were broadly on track with implementing our strategy, and in fact had made already several really great strides, including things such as the development of the digital centres in libraries, the removal of fines, the start of the My Open Library programme. But almost exactly at the midpoint of the strategy, COVID-19 hit Ireland as much as it did anywhere else. And as of March the 12th, all of our libraries closed their doors and entered into that first period of lockdown. We had to undertake a number of very practical things very quickly. We had to make adjustments in the LMS to make sure that people's memberships, which normally only last a year, were extended. So those people who were coming up to have their membership sort of needing to be renewed, we extended their membership beyond that time. We stopped people being able to make reserves on the National Delivery Service because it needed to be suspended. And the vans that were taking the books between libraries had to stand down. And we obviously disabled the reserves in the LMS to prevent people sort of making an order and waiting months to have that delivered. The library staff were going into the buildings and obviously manning the library phones and the online services. But the Irish government pretty quickly moved to developing something called the community call, so that there were locally available helplines for people to engage with. If you'll cast your minds back to the start of the lockdown period, obviously there were so many questions that needed to be answered. People weren't sure what was going to be happening. And a lot of our library staff were deployed at the start of the first lockdown to support the community call initiative. Something happened on March the 12th, or when the Taoiseach, which is the leader of the country, made a address to the whole country, a televised address. And I think something very positive happened there. Librarians were explicitly mentioned as members of the community that were going to support the country's reaction to COVID. And I think that was a very positive thing for our sector to hear. And it's something that sort of stayed with us, knowing that our efforts were almost immediately sort of noted, or the fact that we were going to be involved was immediately noted from the very start of the COVID situation. And I think that the sort of the trust in mentioning us in the very first televised address really paid off, because I think it's very fair to say that the libraries in Ireland reacted extremely well to the difficult situation that we found ourselves in. We very quickly had to work out which services we could continue without having access to the library buildings for the public. And we focused initially on continuing where we had the resources to do housebound delivery services, particularly to older and vulnerable and cocooning members of communities, through vans and book deliveries to nursing homes. And we also made available outside the doors of the library government documentation, which was very important initially as we went to lockdown for people who were seeking to find out how to access government support funds, for example, or unemployment benefits. We switched very quickly to promoting the digital services that we had. And we saw a massive amount of new members joining the library. Year-on-year comparison, you can see in the slide there, in 2019 in March, we had 17,000 new members. In 2020, we had nearly double that, at 30,000. And if you look at the increases we saw just in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown period, 313% increase in new users of the ebooks and e-audiobook service, people taking online courses in their thousands, massive increases in access to language courses and online newspapers. People were ready to embrace the digital services that we had. And we discovered that, for many people, this was something they weren't aware of. And that meant that for us, it was a very positive news story, that people realized that they could continue engaging with their library services without being able to go through the doors of their local library. We also had to move our activities online, and this was a slightly steeper learning curve because a lot of traditional library activities, particularly those for kids, involve children being in the library for story times and for activities, and we had to move those things very quickly online. So we obviously utilized all the platforms that you're all familiar with, including things like Facebook Live, and we saw a surprisingly large uptake of these activities with tens of thousands of views on YouTube of our online story times. But we also had to do something very quickly, which I think a number of other countries came up against. We certainly took our cue from Australia, which was that, you know, when you're reading a book in the library to kids, you don't need an agreement from the publisher of that book to be able to do so. It's covered under the exceptions for libraries in copyright law. But when you're actually doing that online and effectively making a copy of that book through a digital recording, we decided very early on that we needed to have a clear agreement with the publishing community in Ireland that we could do that. And fortunately, we managed to get that very quickly from the Irish publishers, so that they agreed that they would basically, you know, agreed that they were quite happy for us to be reading Irish story times during the lockdown period and beyond until we got back to normal. And in fact, it led to a great partnership where we placed a real big focus on Irish authors and children's books in the spring of the year for our Spring into Storytime program, which is part of that Right to Read program that I mentioned. And then we also turned over the 3D printers that we had in the libraries to the health service so that they were able to use them to print PPE. This happened at the beginning of the lockdown period, and again was a very good news story for the sector and showed that, you know, that latent capacity with the technology is something that we could really be using. And then, you know, we found very quickly we had to have our own health and safety guidelines that were specific for libraries. And much like the rest of the sector, you know, we're really trying to find out, you know, what needs to be quarantined and what didn't. And we managed to get that down pretty early on so that people felt safe working with library materials. We were very well supported. The DRCD gave us online funding for, also additional funding for online resources. And that's something which I think everybody's going to have to be thinking about in the coming years is, you know, this massive explosion in demand for electronic materials, ebooks and e-audiobooks. It's not cheap. It's not for free. So that was very, very useful for us to be able to get additional funding for that. There was also funding to improve the buildings during the periods, you know, when we're closed. There was the possibility to do small scale capital works. We got extra funding from the Dormant Accounts Fund on COVID-related programming, and also we're able to purchase print book stock for adults just getting back into reading. And we were able to do some really interesting little pilots as well. One of them with Microsoft, which is ongoing, looks at extending library Wi-Fi beyond the premises of the buildings into the community, which is very useful if the building itself is closed and people want to access internet, and not everybody has broadband connections in their home. So our airband pilot project, which, as I say, is about to really kick off now, was something very exciting that we were able to work on during the lockdown. My team, Libraries Development, very quickly worked with the county librarians to develop a number of pieces of guidance on health and safety so that we could work out best practice for dealing with the impact of COVID. So we did a big document on phased reopening, how to hold online activities and meetings, what sort of booking software was out there, how to run a contact and collect service. I'll talk about that in a minute. The sorts of guidance you need for letting people back in the buildings to browse, letting people back in the building to use study spaces. And this all came together under a standard operating guidance document. We call them SOGs. The library one is SOG 23. This is a timeline, and I don't know if any of my colleagues from Copenhagen are watching, but I've basically stolen their diagram and inserted my own information into it. But this gives you this sort of timeline of what happened after we closed the buildings on the 12th of March all the way through to where we are now. So we closed at first, and as I mentioned, we switched very quickly to physical delivery, and that really was the main focus in April and May. At the same time, the library staff were often being redeployed in some places to staff those community call services and work on PPE. In the beginning of June, the government began to offer a reopening roadmap, had 5 phases, and we were able to gradually stagger the provision of library services across the phases starting with contact and collect. You literally contact the library and say that you'd like these books. Can I come by and pick them up? And then they'd be available for you through an appointment, all the way through to reopening the doors finally and letting people back in June and July, where we were able to sort of have nearly half of the branches in the country offering that ability. Some of the others continue to offer contact and collect. And at that point, we were able to resume the national delivery service, so people were able to reserve books again. And by the time we got through to August, we were beginning to feel a bit more confident. We'd been able to extend opening hours. Obviously, some libraries had to deal with the fact that some staff members were in the vulnerable categories and they couldn't come to work, and some of our smaller libraries, even at that point, weren't able to fully open. But more and more of our libraries were back to normal, opening up the spaces again for study space, offering PCs, offering photocopiers. But then, as I think you may well be familiar already, in September, things started to look very much like we were experiencing a second wave. So whilst we had our 5-phase reopening roadmap, in September, the government moved to a bigger sort of picture and gave us a plan for living with COVID-19 that covered a 6-month period. And this plan basically offered 5 levels for the entire society to work through, with 1 being the least restrictive and 5 being the most restrictive. And you can see in the box there that libraries, we were able to be open in levels 1 and 2, and then from there we slowly moved through to closing the doors and reoffering contact and collect, and in levels 4 and 5 it's online services only. And somewhat sadly, I have to say, we've unfortunately found ourselves in the position very quickly, with the whole country starting on level 2 from the 15th of September. Very quickly, we found ourselves unfortunately moving through the phases to the point that actually, as of the 21st of October, the whole country is now back to level 5, and we are effectively back where we were on the 12th of March. So the whole slide really sums it up for you. And we are back to a lockdown situation where our main emphasis is on digital services, and we are effectively wondering what's going to happen to us next. And I'm just going to sort of conclude the presentation in a minute with that sort of what are the implications here for the strategy. But at the bottom there, I will point out that there's a massive growth in digital here. So there was some real popular services we were offering and a big impact. Just run through very quickly, what have we actually seen, and what does this mean for our strategy? Well, we're trying to get greater engagement with the service, and it's no surprise that with the buildings closed, we've seen footfall substantially decrease, and we have our annual visitor figures there from our body called NOAC, nearly 17 million last year, down to just over 4 million as of August this year. We did see a big jump when we reopened in June, July, but really we're 70% down. And when the libraries were open, foot traffic was not picking up. Big impact there on what we want to achieve with the strategy in terms of engagement. Our issues as well, another good sign of engagement with our services, also down. I mean, what I'm reporting here is not going to be a surprise, and thankfully everybody is very accepting of it in terms of our decision makers. But yes, issues down substantially, renewals down, and consistent with the footfall effects. And membership, well, maybe this hasn't gone down perhaps as much as we thought, because we've seen a lot more people come on to our BorrowBox, our digital lending service, during the year. We're down in terms of new members about 12% on the same period, but actually, we've seen a massive increase in the users of the digital service. So this has been very, very positive. It does have implications for where we're going to go in the future, of course. And this slide here shows you some of the impacts on, the switch to digital here in terms of the increases in new users, loans, reserves for our BorrowBox service, and then for our e-magazines as well, percentage increases year on year. And that also goes for the online learning, which was a very popular thing for people to pick up during the first lockdown, and some of our language courses. Our programs also, were able to be delivered online, which was actually surprising that we were actually able to deliver quite big amounts of our proposed programming during the lockdown period. So not so much of an impact as perhaps we might have felt, and a lot of issues and a lot of viewing of our online activities. So when it comes to programs, perhaps not as bad as it might have been, but also bringing with it new challenges for the online environment. And this idea of when we're actually going to be able to go back to organising events, that does seem to be a long way off, particularly now that we're at level 5. So this is where we were at the end of September, with nearly 80% of the sector open, and the services coming back online. But as I mentioned, just the month after that, we found ourselves in a very, very different situation. And this is the real big overview of where we've gone throughout the lifetime of the strategy, and sort of what we're going to have to do to make up the gap, because our sort of membership is obviously down as a result. The active members are down, the issues are down, and the visits are substantially down. So yeah, very, very tricky in terms of the hard numbers to basically ascertain where it is that we're going to get to. And I'm going to actually stop on that slide. And I said that in conclusion, I sort of offer a few observations rather than sort of anything sort of concrete, because is it too soon for really us to say exactly what the effect this is going to have on our ambitions in the strategy? We can tell that the numbers are down, but we can tell that the goodwill to the service is very, very high. We've got a lot of support for government. We're going to have a recognition that this was something which we couldn't see coming, and in many ways we've been able to adapt through the use of digital services particularly, but also through things like contact and collect. And in fact, going back to some of the more maybe overlooked pieces of library work in recent years, such as making book recommendations, those have been really, really well received in the context of our contact and collect work. So when you take all of that together, it's actually perhaps more positivity in the situation than we might and have initially thought. But there's no denying that in terms of a 5-year strategy, we've effectively lost 6 months at least, if not a year by the time this is finished, of time during which we had wanted to really push some of our initiatives much further along in terms of the aims and objectives and reaching them. COVID, I think, has shown the best parts of the library staff in Ireland. It's shown that you don't always have to have the building open, but over time we've also known and acknowledged that a lot of people are missing the contact that they have through our community institutions, through our public libraries. And this, I think, is going to be a really interesting challenge for us for the remainder of our strategy period. That how can we take the best bits that we've learned from our COVID reaction, the online activities, the digital resources, and how can we combine them with our physical resources to give a sort of perhaps a new and hybrid service that's actually going to be able to deal with what's almost certainly still going to be another really tricky 6-month period before, fingers crossed, we get a vaccine for this virus and are able to go back to normal. So, I guess this is the long way around to saying that I don't have any sort of hard and fast conclusions about exactly whether we're going to be able to achieve our strategy or not. But I do know that a lot has been thrown up in terms of questions. And I am sorry that we all can't be in one place, so that I could perhaps take questions and answers now to sort of dig into some of these pieces. But I am happy to be contacted through my email, which is shamilton, one word, @lgma.ie. And just get in touch and I'll see if I can tease out anything more from you. But I hope this has been interesting, at least to give you a bit of an idea about what the Irish public library sector looks like and how we reacted to the COVID-19 crisis. Thanks a lot.